The song was already half over before Daniel realized he'd started the second verse instead of the third. He was standing alone at the front of the rehearsal room, the overhead lights still on their full setting from the evening's practice. And the quiet that had replaced 40 voices was so complete, he could hear the hum of the radiator along the east wall. He had not meant to sing. He had meant to lock up. His keys were in his jacket pocket, and his jacket was draped over the back of the last folding chair he had not yet returned to the storage closet. And somewhere between picking up the jacket and understanding that the room was truly empty, he had simply opened his mouth and begun. He got 3 lines in before he felt the seam in the lyric, the small wrong turn, the verse that did not belong where he had placed it. He stopped. The radiator hummed. The fluorescent fixture above the piano made its thin sound. And then, from the corner near the window where the curtain had not been fully drawn, a voice completed the line he had dropped. It was a low, unhurried voice, and it named the right words without ceremony, the way someone finishes a sentence they have heard before and find unremarkable. The voice belonged to the woman who had spent the past 2 weeks sitting quietly at the piano bench, turning pages, playing what she was asked to play, and saying very little else. Daniel had not known she was still in the room. He had not known much about her at all. That would be what he remembered afterward, when the rest of it had settled, when Constance had gone quiet and the board chair had said what she said in the rehearsal room doorway, and every small misunderstanding had been corrected at once. He would remember the radiator, the wrong verse, and the voice that finished it, without asking why he had started in the wrong place. He had been unlocking the art centre since the January after they hired him, which meant he had been unlocking it for 3 years, 2 months, and approximately 40 Monday evenings by the time Mara arrived. The building was a converted mill structure near the edge of the town's older commercial block, with high ceilings that the choir director had always praised, and drafty windows along the north face that nobody had fixed because the board kept tabling the estimate. The rehearsal room was on the 2nd floor. The stairs were narrow and the handrail was loose in a particular way that every regular had learned to accommodate by placing their hand 6 inches lower than instinct suggested. Daniel knew the building the way you learn something you have handled repeatedly in the dark. He knew that the 3rd storage closet door swelled in wet weather and needed a shoulder to open. He knew that the folding chairs stacked imperfectly unless you alternated the fold direction every other chair. He knew that the piano had a sticky F-sharp above middle C, and that anyone who played without being warned would pause on that note and frown, and then compensate quietly or loudly depending on their temperament. He set out 32 chairs before every rehearsal. He had been setting out the same 32 for the past year, since the ensemble had stabilized at that number after the spring recruitment drive added 6 new members, and the subsequent attrition through summer took 3 back. He set them in 6 rows with a center aisle that Constance liked, because it gave her room to move when she was conducting and wanted to address a specific section by walking toward them. Constance liked a great many things done in specific ways, and she had never once thanked him for knowing what those ways were. She was, by her own account and by the account of the framed citation near the 2nd floor landing, the founding director of the Halcyon Community Choir. 14 years she had run it. 14 years of regional competitions, of holiday concerts in the old Methodist church on Fenwick Street, of a level of local prominence that she wore the way some people wear a coat in August, constantly and without apparent awareness that it might not be necessary. She was not unkind the way cruel people are unkind, with awareness and intention. She was unkind the way someone is unkind when they have simply never considered that the person setting out the chairs might have an interior life that the chairs do not exhaust. Daniel had a tenor voice that Ruth Ellison had described the previous October as the best untrained voice she had heard in 40 years of community singing. Ruth was 81 and had sung in 6 different ensembles across 3 states, and she said it the way she said most things, quietly, looking at her music folder without apparent need for anyone to agree. Daniel had been standing beside her when she said it, and she had not been speaking to him. She had been speaking to the woman on her other side, who had nodded and then immediately forgotten it in the shuffle of getting to the next page. Daniel had not forgotten it. He had also not repeated it to anyone, and had not offered it as evidence when Constance told him, 6 weeks after that rehearsal, that the regional showcase would require strong featured soloists and that she was thinking of Marcus Aldrin and the Dietrich sisters, and probably a 4th voice from outside the ensemble, someone with conservatory training. She had said this while Daniel was collecting the music folders at the end of rehearsal, and she had said it the way she might have said it to the room, without particularly meaning for it to reach anyone. It reached him. He went home that night, and he did not say anything to anyone about it, because there was no one to say anything to. He lived in the upper half of a 2-family house on Clement Street, 12 minutes' walk from the Arts Centre, and his evenings were usually quiet. He had a shelf of music scores above the kitchen table and a second-hand recording of the regional ensemble's last 3 showcases that he had found at the library sale and played sometimes while he ate. He was not, as far as anyone at the Arts Centre was aware, someone who studied music with any seriousness. He set out chairs. He troubleshot the 3rd closet door. He replaced the music stand clips when they broke, because he was the one who noticed when they broke. That was the shape of him, as far as Constance knew. Mara arrived on a Tuesday evening in late February, 6 days before the story's present day. She came in while Daniel was still setting out the last row of chairs, and she stood for a moment in the doorway in a coat that was too thin for the weather, carrying a bag over one shoulder and a small portfolio case in the other hand. She looked at the piano first, then at the room, then at Daniel. "Is there a person I should check in with?" she asked. "Constance Webb usually comes in around 6:40, he said. "You can leave your things here. The piano bench opens if you need storage." She nodded. She set her bag down and looked at the piano bench and did not open it. He finished the last row and went to fold the chair covers back into the closet. And when he came back, she was seated at the piano, not playing, just resting her hands on her knees, and looking at the keyboard the way you look at something you're deciding how to approach. The sticky F-sharp was directly in front of her. "That one's a problem," he said from across the room. She looked up. "The F-sharp above middle C, it sticks on the downstroke. If you're accompanying in any key with a lot of sharps, you'll feel it." She pressed it once, lightly. It stuck and then released. "Compensation or avoidance?" she asked. "Most people compensate. Ruth, in the back row, she's the only one who's mentioned avoiding. She transposes whatever she's singing down a half step when she can manage it." Mara pressed the key again. "Compensation," she said without making it a question. That was the whole of it, that first evening. She played what Constance asked her to play. She did not make a mistake, and she did not show off. And when Constance ran the 3rd section of the showcase piece 3 times in a row to address a timing issue in the altos, Mara simply played it 3 times, without comment. Daniel noticed this. He was not sure what he was noticing, but he noticed it. The following Tuesday, a light fixture in the storage corridor went out, and Daniel replaced it before anyone arrived. He was on the stepladder with the old tube still in his hands when Mara came up the stairs. She stopped on the landing and waited without being asked, holding the fixture panel steady against the wall until he had the new tube seated, and then she said, "Thank you for doing that." The way someone says it when they mean the general category of work, not just the specific errand. He said, "It was going to go soon anyway," she said, still. He came down from the ladder, and she went into the rehearsal room, and for a reason he could not fully articulate, he thought about that brief exchange for the rest of the evening. The trouble with Constance had been building for a while in the specific way that quiet accumulations build. Nothing you could point to and name, just a series of small corrections delivered in front of others that had the cumulative effect of a door being closed 1 inch at a time. She had corrected his posture during a warm-up exercise in January, which was reasonable. She had corrected his blend in December, which was also reasonable. She had, at the February rehearsal 2 weeks before the showcase, corrected him in a manner that was not directed at his singing at all. He had suggested during the break that the third movement of the showcase piece might land better if the featured soloists came down stage during the second chorus rather than holding their positions. He had said it quietly, to no one in particular, the way he said most things. Constance had been passing with a cup of tea, and she stopped. "Daniel," she said, "the staging is set." "I know, I was just thinking about sight lines." "The staging," she said again, with a patience that was not patience at all, "is set. You're welcome to focus on your part, which is the second row, third from the right." 3 people heard it. Ruth was one of them. A younger man named Travis, who sang baritone and had been in the choir for only 1 season, was another. The third was Mara, who was seated at the piano and had her hands flat on her thighs, and was looking at her music. No one said anything. Daniel said, "Right," and picked up his music folder. That was a Tuesday. The following Thursday, he stayed late to fix the closet door, which had swelled badly in the week's rain, and he was working on the hinge when he heard Constance's voice from the room at the end of the corridor. The room was used for board meetings and occasionally for small sectional rehearsals, and the door was not fully latched. Her voice carried cleanly down the hall. She was speaking to someone he did not recognize, a man whose voice was lower and who seemed to be asking questions about the upcoming showcase and the program's funding from the Regional Arts Board. "The issue," Constance was saying, "is that the program has grown in a way that requires proper personnel. People with real musical training. What I have now is a group of committed community members, which is lovely, and a few people who've been with us for years out of loyalty rather than ability. Daniel's a perfect example. He's reliable, he cares about the place, but he has no real future here in any meaningful musical capacity. The board has to understand that we need a different class of participant for what comes next." The man said something Daniel could not hear clearly. Constance said, "He's the one who sets up the chairs." The closet door hinge was cold in his hands. He stood there with the screwdriver and the wood and the swollen door frame, and he did not move for a moment that had no particular length. Then he set the screwdriver down carefully on the storage shelf, closed the closet as far as it would go without the repaired hinge, and went downstairs and out through the side entrance into the wet February air. He told himself, walking home, that it was not a surprise. It was not. He had understood the shape of things without naming the shape, the way you understand where a low ceiling is in a familiar dark room. But understanding something and hearing it, said plainly in someone else's voice, were 2 different experiences. And he could feel the difference on the walk home, the way you feel the cold differently when it is very still. He went home. He ate without tasting anything. He sat at his kitchen table with the recording from the library sale, and he listened to the third movement of last year's showcase, the one he had not been asked to sing in. He slept badly. At the next rehearsal, Constance brought up the showcase assignments. She did it with warmth, the particular warmth that is a different thing from kindness. The featured soloists were Marcus and the Dietrich sisters, and a young woman named Priya, who had indeed trained at a conservatory and who had a voice of genuine weight and control. The ensemble would provide support throughout, Constance said. Everyone had an important role. She looked at Daniel when she said, everyone, in a way that was meant to be generous and was something else entirely. After rehearsal, most of the ensemble filed out quickly. Travis had a bus to catch. Ruth stayed to gather her things slowly, the way she always did, and she caught Daniel's eye near the door and held it for a moment with an expression that said she had heard what had been said in that corridor, even though she had not been there, and that she was sorry, and that she was not going to make a speech about it, because she was Ruth, and speeches were not her way. "You'll be here Tuesday?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, and went carefully down the stairs with one hand on the rail, 6 inches lower than instinct suggested. Mara had not left yet. She was putting the sheet music in order on top of the piano, squaring the edges of each page with a steadiness that was unconnected to speed. Daniel began collecting the folding chairs. She said, without turning around, "You have a good ear for staging." He stopped with a chair in each hand. "The suggestion you made about the downstage movement," she said. "It was right." He set the chairs against the wall. He did not know what to do with the sentence, so he did not do anything with it, and she did not seem to require a response. But that night, walking home, he turned the sentence over twice and found it did not feel like comfort offered out of pity. It felt like a fact being reported, the way you report a fact about a stuck piano key. Here is the thing that is true. Take it or leave it. He took it. He kept setting out the chairs. He kept compensating for the F sharp when it was his turn to play for sectional warm-ups, which was not often. He watched Mara at the piano during the long run-throughs, and he noticed things he did not name, that she played the difficult passages at tempo and the simpler passages with slightly more care, as though the simple ones were harder to sustain than the complex ones. That she listened to the ensemble with a quality of attention that looked like stillness, but was not stillness. That she answered Constance's requests without deferring to them, the way someone does when they are agreeing with the logic of a request, rather than with the authority of the person making it. He did not say any of this to anyone because there was no opening that would not have seemed strange. On the last Thursday before the showcase, Constance came to Daniel after rehearsal and said in a reasonable and almost kind voice that she wanted to talk about the upcoming weekend. She said the showcase was a significant event for the program and that the board would be present, and that she wanted to be thoughtful about the ensemble's presentation. She said she thought it might be best if Daniel considered attending as an audience member rather than as a performer, given that his part in the program was a supporting role, and the ensemble would be just as well served without his particular contribution. She said this while straightening the music folders on the stand near the door. Daniel stood in the room and looked at the window where the curtain was not fully drawn and said, "All right." Constance seemed to expect more than that, and when more did not arrive, she said, "You've been such a reliable presence here. The work you do for the space is really invaluable." He said, "I'll be there Saturday." She paused. "As an audience member," she said. He said, "I'll be there Saturday," and left it at that. He went home that night and stood in his kitchen and looked at the music scores on the shelf above the table. He had been singing the third movement's second tenor part in his kitchen for 4 weeks, not because he had any formal expectation of being asked to sing it publicly, but because the shape of the music required completion, and he was the only one in the kitchen. He had learned Marcus's featured verse because it was there, and because learning something all the way through was better than learning it part way and stopping at the seam. He would go to the showcase on Saturday. He had told Constance he would be there. He had not told her in what capacity. That still left Friday evening. Mara had asked Constance whether she could use the rehearsal room for an hour of independent practice before the showcase, and Constance had said yes without much interest. Daniel had volunteered to stay and lock up, as he always did, because locking up was his. The rehearsal room was quiet by 7:30. Mara was at the piano, working through the program's third movement. Daniel stacked chairs and straightened the rows she had not needed, and worked his way to the back of the room in the easy, practiced silence of someone who has learned to exist usefully in a space without claiming it. He picked up his jacket from the last chair. He did not put it on. He was standing at the front of the room, in the light, and the quiet was full, and the radiator hummed, and before he could make a decision, he was 3 lines into the third movement's second verse, and the lyric had gone wrong. Not catastrophically, just the particular wrongness of a false turn taken without enough attention, a word that lived 2 measures later, arriving 2 measures early. He stopped. The room held its breath. And then Mara's voice, from the corner near the curtain, completed the line correctly. 4 words, plain and unhurried, as though she were simply confirming the door was unlocked. She had been sitting on the low windowsill with her portfolio case across her knees, and she had not left, and he had not known. He looked at her. She said, "Try it from the beginning of the verse." He did. His voice moved through the room the way voices move in high-ceiling spaces, finding the walls and returning differently. He sang the verse correctly and the chorus that followed it, and by the time he stopped, they were both quiet, and the radiator was the only sound. She said, "That's the voice Ruth talks about," he said. "Ruth talks about it?" "She mentions it approximately every other rehearsal," Mara said, "to whoever is sitting near her." He set his jacket over the back of the nearest chair. "How long have you been watching this ensemble?" She looked at the piano keys. She pressed the F-sharp lightly and released it. "Long enough," she said. He understood this was not the complete answer. He understood also that she was not going to give him the complete answer tonight, and that pressing her for it was not the thing the moment required. "Saturday," he said. She looked up. "Are you going?" "Yes." "In what capacity?" she asked, and it was the same question Constance had asked with none of Constance's subtext. He said, "The only one I have." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the piano. She began to play the opening of the third movement, quietly, at the tempo suited to one voice and one room, and he stood where he was and let the music move through the space and did not say anything else, and neither did she. The Regional Arts Showcase was held in the Fenwick Cultural Centre, a larger venue 2 towns over that had a proper stage with working sightlines and a house capacity of 340. The Halcyon Choir was the third act on the programme, after a youth string quartet and a modern dance ensemble from the County Arts School. Daniel arrived before the building opened and sat on the steps outside with a cup of coffee from the cart across the street, and he watched the other performers arriving with their cases and their nerves and their coordinated warm-up rituals, and he drank his coffee and looked at the clouds, which were the flat, pale grey of late February, without any threat in them. He went inside when the doors opened. He did not sit in the audience. He went backstage, where the ensemble was gathering in the green room, and when Constance looked up and saw him, she had a fraction of a second in which her face arranged itself into something before she could manage the arrangement. "Daniel," she said. "I'm here," he said. Travis, who was sitting on a folding bench tying his shoe, looked up and said, "Good," with the simple totality of someone who had not considered there was anything complicated about it. Ruth was in the corner on a padded chair they had found for her, and when she saw Daniel, she put both her hands on the arms of the chair and pushed herself slightly more upright. And that was her response, the small ceremony of sitting up straighter. Constance said, "I thought we discussed your role today." Daniel said, "We did." She looked at him. He looked back. There was a pause in which she could have pressed further, and she would have pressed further, except that the stage manager came in at that moment to give the 15-minute call, and the room reorganized itself around the call, and Constance moved toward the ensemble with the particular authority of a woman who has 14 years of program direction to marshal, and the moment passed without settling. The performance began on time. Daniel stood in his row, third from the right, and sang the parts he was supposed to sing, and the ensemble moved through the first two movements with the practiced coherence of a group that had spent 16 weeks on the same material. Marcus sang his featured verse with the confidence of someone who had been told he had the best voice in the room and had believed it appropriately. The Dietrich sisters harmonized with the precision they had been working toward all season. Priya, the conservatory-trained fourth soloist, produced exactly the voice she had been recruited to produce. And at the start of the third movement's second verse, when the featured soloists should have stepped forward and Daniel's row should have fallen to a soft support line, he simply continued to sing. Not louder, not performatively. He sang the way he sang in the rehearsal room on a Friday night, the way he sang in his kitchen on Clement Street while the library recording played. The way you do a thing when you have decided the reason for doing it has nothing to do with whether anyone of consequence is watching. The ensemble around him adjusted, the way ensembles do. Travis, without turning his head, sang the support line slightly quieter to make room. Ruth, in the back row, closed her eyes. From the wing, where Mara was standing with her portfolio case over her shoulder, watching, he could not see her face. He found out later what it had looked like. He found it out from Ruth, who had a clear sight line to the wing from the back row, and who said, with her usual economy, that Mara had looked like someone watching something arrive that they had been waiting to find. The movement ended. The house applauded. Constance was in the wing on the opposite side, and she was looking at Daniel with the particular expression of someone who has been contradicted and is still deciding how to process the contradiction. And then the stage manager was ushering everyone toward the post-performance gathering in the center lobby. And whatever Constance had been preparing to say was swallowed by the movement of 40 people toward the same doorway. The lobby was broad and carpeted, with tall windows facing the parking area and a refreshment table along the east wall. The board members were already there, scattered among the performers and audience members, in the way that boards scatter at public events, with the practiced approachability of people who have learned to move in rooms like this. Daniel was standing near the refreshment table with a cup of water when he heard a woman's voice say, clearly and across a small distance, Mara Sloan. He turned toward the sound. A woman in a dark blazer was crossing the lobby with purpose, and she was looking at Mara with the expression of genuine recognition, the kind that does not calculate before it shows. She was Margaret Holt, whose name was on the Regional Arts Board letterhead that Daniel had seen twice in Constance's office, whose title was Board Chair and Regional Music Director, Fenwick County Arts Council. She said, "I didn't know you were here. Are you evaluating the Halcyon program?" Mara said, "I've been with the ensemble for 2 weeks." Margaret said, 2 weeks, in what role? Mara said, accompanist. Margaret laughed, the warm, short laugh of someone who has just understood something. "You played the whole program tonight." "I did," Mara said. "It's a strong program, stronger in some elements than the current structure supports." Margaret said, "Which elements?" Mara looked for a moment toward where Daniel was standing. She said, "The tenor section has a voice that isn't being used at the level it belongs." Constance had been working her way toward Margaret, the natural gravity of a program director toward a board chair at a public event, and she arrived at the edge of this conversation in time to hear what Mara had just said, and not in time to have anticipated it. She stood there with her own cup and her own smile and, Whatever she had been preparing to say to Margaret had no longer been assembled for this version of the room. Margaret turned to Constance and said, in the straightforward way that board chairs are entitled to, "How long has Mara been part of your program?" Constance said, "She came on recently as a volunteer accompanist. I had no idea she was affiliated with the council." Margaret said, "She evaluates programs independently. It's standard practice." She turned back to Mara and said, "You'll write it up?" "Yes," Mara said. Margaret turned back to Constance, not with hostility, but with the particular directness of someone who has new information and does not need to be theatrical about it. "I'd like to meet with the ensemble director next week, and I'd like to include the tenor section lead in that conversation." She looked at Daniel, whose location Mara had indicated without pointing. "What's your name?" he said. "Daniel Hayes." She said, "Good. I'll have my office reach out to Constance to schedule something." She turned away toward another board member with the easy finality of someone who does not require scenes to be scenes. Constance stood where she was. Her cup was in both hands, and she was looking at a point slightly past Daniel's left shoulder. She said, in a voice that had lost most of its usual carrying quality, "I didn't know who she was." Daniel said, "I know." She looked at him directly then, the first time all evening she had looked at him without calculating something. She said, "I made a misjudgment." He said, "It wasn't really about her." She looked at him for another moment. He held it, not unkindly. He had spent 3 years setting out 32 chairs and fixing the hinge on the third closet door and compensating for the F-sharp, and he was not interested in a scene that would require her to diminish herself and him to feel compensated. He was interested in singing in the spring program. He was interested in the conversation with Margaret's office. He was interested in walking back across the lobby to where Mara was talking with Ruth, who had found a chair near the window and settled into it with the contentment of a woman who has watched something arrive that she predicted. He walked back across the lobby. Ruth looked up at him and said, "That third verse was correct." He said, "It was." She said, "Finally," and accepted the small plate of food that Travis had brought her, without having been asked, because Travis was learning. Mara was standing near Ruth's chair, and when Daniel came to stand beside her, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Margaret will want the program to expand the tenor section for the fall cycle." He said, "Is that what you'll write?" She said, "Among other things." He said, "You've been evaluating this program for 2 weeks." She said, "I've been accompanying it for 2 weeks. The evaluation started earlier." He thought about this. "The portfolio case," he said. She said, "And other things." He thought about the Tuesday on the landing when she had held the fixture panel, and said, "Still." He thought about the Friday night and the wrong verse and the 4 words she had offered without making anything of them. He said, "When did you decide?" She looked at him with the small, careful candor of someone who has spent 2 weeks not answering questions and is now choosing to answer one. "I had already made a determination when I arrived," she said. "What I didn't know was the voice." He understood this was an answer that contained several other answers, and that he did not need all of them tonight. "Saturday," he said without thinking. She looked at him, and after a moment, she understood he was echoing the word from Friday, from the rehearsal room, from the conversation they had carried without completing. She said, "Yes." They drove back to the Arts Centre in separate cars because they had arrived separately, and because that was the shape of things that evening. But when Daniel came up the stairs with his keys and found the building dark and quiet, Mara was already on the landing, having parked in the small lot on the building's west side. She had her portfolio case over one shoulder and her coat, still too thin for February, and she was waiting without waiting, the way you stand outside a door when you are not sure whether it will be opened. He opened it. The building was cold and still, the way it is when it has been empty for a few hours, and the radiators have settled to their minimum. He turned on the stairwell light, and they went up, past the loose handrail that Mara had learned to accommodate, 6 inches lower than instinct, and into the rehearsal room. He turned on the lights over the piano. The 32 chairs were still where the returning ensemble had left them, not in their 6 careful rows, but scattered and turned, the after-image of 40 people gathering their things and moving toward the door. The storage closet was closed, its hinge working smoothly now. The curtain on the north window was half drawn, as it always was when no one had thought to finish the job. Mara sat at the piano bench. She pressed the F sharp and held it until it released. Then she set her hands in the opening position of the third movement and looked at Daniel, who was standing at the front of the room where he had stood the night before, in the same light, with his jacket over the back of the same chair. He sang the verse from the beginning, and he sang it correctly this time. His voice moved into the high ceiling and came back, changed, the way it always did in that room, and Mara's hands moved with it on the keys, accompanying without managing, present without crowding. He came to the line where he had stopped the night before, and he continued past it. He finished the verse. He finished the chorus. He finished the bridge that Constance had spent 6 weeks shaping, and that he had learned on his own in his kitchen on Clement Street, with the window dark and the recording playing on the table beside his untouched dinner. When the last note had settled into the room and the room had drawn it in, they were both quiet. The radiator hummed. The fluorescent fixture above the piano made its thin sound. Mara lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest on her knees, and the silence that followed was not the silence of something ending, but of something that had been waiting a long time to be completed, now complete.